Okay, good evening, everyone. Kevin Gruneweg here, your Wichita Audubon Vice President, here to introduce our speaker for this evening. But before I do that, a couple things to go over before we get down to that. As far as upcoming events, I just wanted to mention we do have a field trip coming up this Saturday to the Slate Creek wetlands. And so if you're interested in that, we're meeting at 8 o'clock at the Slate Valley Church, which is on Oxford Road, south of Oxford, about 7 miles south. And so meet there at 8 o'clock. That's a morning thing, so it'll go to about noon, so no need to bring a lunch on that one. But should be hopefully some interesting sparrows, usually lots of LeConte sparrows, but maybe if we're lucky, maybe we'll get a Nelson sparrow, so we'll see how that goes. And then, of course, the only other thing coming up here in the near future is our usual second Saturday bird walk, which is Saturday the 13th of November. So that'll be at the Great Plains Nature Center. So everyone is welcome to attend that one as well. So with that out of the way, tonight's speaker is Lyndzee Rhine, and she's, by way of introduction there, she's author of the Pocket Guide to Common Kansas Mushrooms, and she's currently the Outdoor Skills and Recruitment Coordinator for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks in Pratt. And so she works introducing the public to new skills such as mushroom identification, bird watching, archery, hunting, and fishing. So with that, I will toss it over to Lyndzee and take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. So as Kevin said, my name is Lyndzee Rhine. I've been with the Department of Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks since January of this year, so I'm still relatively new to the agency. I previously worked as a naturalist at the Great Plains Nature Center, where I did all kinds of stuff as well. And I'm really excited to be here and present to you a topic that I have become rather obsessed with. It's fascinating. I tell as many people as I can. I've brought it up a couple of times in a couple of other presentations that I've done, but I've never really expanded on it quite as much as I have, like I'm going to this evening. So this will be a little bit of an adventure for all of us. My interest in fungi actually started when I was a kid. I was one of those kids that was always looking at things that your parents don't really want you to look at, like dead stuff and poop and fungi. And I had a lot of questions about all of these things, particularly mushrooms that were growing in the yard, and no one could answer the questions that I had. So I took it upon myself to learn as much as I could about it. And I've been studying and learning as much about fungi as I can for the last 10 plus years or so. And I have a particular fondness for mystery mushrooms, ones that I don't know like the back of my hand or require a little more digging. I love IDing things, and I have a particular interest in how humans interact with fungi and vice versa. I love talking to people about mushrooms and fungi, and I'll often stop strangers on the trail and, like a total crazy person, enthusiastically exclaim, "Come look at this mushroom over here, it's so cool." And I've actually been described by some of my colleagues as a bridge troll, just waiting to spring mushroom information on unsuspecting passerbyers. So that's kind of the gist about that. I'm gonna turn my video off for the remainder of this presentation until the very end of it. And that's just to really save the bandwidth. I have a couple of videos and high resolution images I'm going to share with you, and I don't want anything to fail on us. So I'm going to dip out for a little bit, but you should still be able to hear me okay. And I'm going to talk about that pocket guide that Kevin mentioned. And as many mycologists would argue, we should be promoting the 3 Fs, flora, fauna, and fungi. The Nature Center, the Great Plains Nature Center, has done a fantastic job of covering the flora and fauna part really well with the other 15 pocket guides that they've helped produce. So I decided it was time to add the other F, and so the Common Kansas Mushrooms Pocket Guide was born. There is a slight caveat to this guide, and it's that though the title says Kansas, it really means the Midwest. Almost all of these species can be found in the surrounding states and some in like throughout all of North America. So if you're on the road, just keep it in your vehicle. And if you find a mushroom, you might be able to find it in there. The other caveat is that in Kansas alone, there are about 750 different known species, and this guide only covers about 49 of them. So it's really not very many. And that's because I was only allowed so many pages and there was a lot of info I needed to cram into this guide. As I mentioned, the guide contains 49 species. I think I originally had like 55 of them picked out for the guide, just based on information I had collected via community science, my own personal data, and frequently asked questions. But I had a page number limit, like I mentioned, and there were other things that needed to be included. Believe me, I would have written about 150 species if I could. And as for the other things I wanted to include in the guide, you can find the general group of mushrooms. And by general basic groups, I mean like coral fungi or cup fungi or gilled mushrooms or boletes, etc. I go over basic ID characteristics that you need to look for when you're trying to ID something. There's a nice chart depicting gill attachment and spacing. It goes over how to make a spore print to help you ID unknown mushrooms. It's got really detailed species accounts, and it goes into mushroom poisonings, what to do if you suspect if you've consumed a poisonous mushrooms, and a frequently asked questions pages. Where can you get this guide? Well, as most of you probably know, at the Great Plains Nature Center, but if you're not near there, you can probably find the rest of the pocket guides, including this one, at other nature centers across the state. You can also just email me. I'm happy to mail you one free of charge. And at the end of this talk, I will put my contact info up again, and feel free to jot it down. Send me all your mushroom questions, because nothing makes me smile happier than getting a mystery mushroom in my email inbox. These guides are available for free to the public thanks to the generous donations of the Chickadee Checkoff Program and the Evergy Green Team. So thank you for spreading the good nature word and helping people really enjoy things and understand their surroundings a lot more. So here is what you can expect from tonight's talk. We're going to cover some basics, and I'm being relatively vague for a reason. I'm going to go over a story that we all know, probably in fairly well detail, and then we're going to get just a little bit spooky, and I thought that was appropriate since we're getting close to a spooky time of year. So let's cover some of these basics, and by basics, for fungi in particular, we're going to go over what the heck even a fungus is, where they are, what they're doing in those places, and what they look like. Okay, so what is a fungi? If you look at this chart right here, you'll notice that there aren't any mushrooms or fungi in either of these major kingdoms, and that's because they don't quite fall under either of these descriptions. They're totally different from plants and animals, but they are more closely related to animals. So because they're so different, they get their own kingdom. And that's pretty much all you really need to know for the gist of this talk in terms of basics, is that they are their own thing, but they are living things. And I'll talk just a little bit more about that here in a moment. So where are they growing? Well, they grow on living trees, and they grow on dead trees. They are in the air. They're literally on your skin. They're in your bodies. They grow on sticks. It's on our food. Sometimes they even help us make our delicious food. You can find them in forests and in deserts. A recent species was discovered to only be found in water, which is crazy. It's everywhere in the dirt, on poop. Essentially, they're just everywhere all of the time, constantly. And that's the big takeaway from this, is that they're everywhere and you're not going to get away from them. But don't let that deter you or freak you out, because it's totally normal. So what are they doing? What are their ecological roles? So the first one is Saprobic, and that's a kind of fungi that is decomposing something in the wild. You can see this beautiful tall glass of water poking out of this little wood chip that I picked up. And if you look closely, this little white speck here is another one that's getting ready to shoot up just like this one is. And this whole wood chip, if I were to break it apart, is full of this stuff called mycelium, which is the actual body of the fungus. But what it's doing is that it's breaking down this wood chip and recycling the nutrients in it. So fungi don't have a digestive system, so they have to excrete enzymes that break down these materials, and then they reabsorb it into their cells. So this saprobic just means breaking down or decomposing. The next one is mycorrhizal, and you've probably heard this one before. There are a couple of different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, but for the sake of not having your eyes glaze over while listening to this talk, I'm not going to go into those because they are pretty technical. But a mycorrhizal fungi is one that has a symbiotic relationship with a plant, and it's not just trees, it turns out. It's shrubs and grasses and forbs and all kinds of stuff. And what's happening here is that the mycelium of the fungi is smaller than a tree root hair. So since it's so small, it actually has more surface area, allowing it to absorb more water. So it helps the tree get more water than it would be able to get on its own. And in exchange, the tree gives that fungi carbohydrates and sugars that the fungi can't get on its own. So they have a mutualistic relationship where they both benefit. And oftentimes that relationship, one cannot live without the other. So if the tree dies, so does the fungi. If the fungi dies, the tree will likely die 10, 20, 30 years later. It takes a while for trees to die. And the very last one, which is one that I kind of want you to keep in your mind, in the back of your minds as we work through this story timeline thing together, because I'm going to kind of paint you a picture of what's going on here. Parasitic ones are ones that live on other living things. That includes insects, other fungi, living trees, and even on humans. Yeah, ringworm, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, is not actually caused by a worm, it's caused by a fungus. So they do come in a lot of different forms. I'm gonna kind of buzz through these really quick just for the sake of saving time. The big thing I want you to take away from this is that not all fungi look like this. These are just the fungi that we can see. Okay. Couple of different species here. This is an inky cap. I love puffballs. I'm a sucker for puffballs. Ugh. This is actually a parasitic fungi that's often found growing on exposed roots at the base of trees. Some of you have probably seen this before. This one was actually taken in Chisholm Creek Park, and I would check on it every year, and it gets just a little bit bigger every year. I haven't checked on it in the last year though, because I moved to a different town, but if you see it out there, let me know how it's doing. This is a jelly fungus, also one of my favorites. You're gonna, if this presentation was more on IDing mushrooms, you would hear me say that's my favorite on every other photo that I show you guys. These are little bird nest fungi, teeny tiny little mushrooms. A stinkhorn, you're all probably familiar with this one. Another puffball. Ganodermas, I don't even know what this is. It's definitely some kind of a cup fungi, but its ID has eluded me. And to this day, I think I found that like, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. And to this day, I still don't know what it is. This stunning coral fungi. But for the sake of today's talk, we're not going to focus on the big stuff. We're going to focus on the small stuff. And it looks like this, and we cannot see it with our naked eye. And I have absolutely no skill in identifying them. But they do a lot for us, and not just in helping us make wine and beer and bread, but they do so much more. Okay, so here are the important things that you need to know about fungi. And I put up a picture of ringworm on a cat. I can't defend that. I don't know why. Anyway, there are 1.5 million known fungal species, but it's actually estimated that that number is closer to 5.1 million. And only a few hundred of those are known to infect mammals. Now, today's talk is all about how fungi may have played a role in the rise of mammals. And right now we're just kind of covering the basics of things. So bear with me. We'll get to the nitty-gritty here in just a second. So most fungal infections that humans get are actually associated with impaired immune system function and human fungal infections weren't considered major pathogens until the late 20th century. And I'll talk just a tiny bit more about this here in a little bit. Most human infections are only found in the dermis layer, so they're usually just like classified as skin infections and not much to worry about. The big thing is that they are living things, which means that they can die if conditions are too harsh. But if they die because of the conditions, there's a very real chance that thanks to this Russian roulette thing called evolution, that a few individuals might survive and pass on those survival traits that allow them to survive in those harsh conditions, and so on and so forth. And as living things, that means they can only handle so much. Now, all fungi have a temperature threshold in which they can no longer grow or they just die from the heat. They heavily rely on proteins just like we do. And if a temperature gets too high, that protein will completely denature, fall apart, and the fungi dies. This threshold of temperature is different for each species, but all you really need to know is that most of the time they can't go above about 32 degrees Celsius or 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And we all hopefully know that the average human body temperature is 98.6 degrees. And the fungi's ideal growing temperature is below 86. So there's kind of a sweet zone in there where they're really, really happy or they're really not doing great. The next basic we need to cover, here's a good description. Here's a good example of that. So as temperature increases, that threshold, they can only handle so much. They'll just plummet and die right off. It's just a good visual to kind of show you that their growth rate stops and then eventually they'll die if the heat gets too high. Okay, so we're going to cover something very interesting, and it might throw you a little bit, but hang with me. And we're going to talk about the battle of cheap living when it comes down to mammals versus reptiles. And we all know the basic differences between mammals and reptiles, but just so we're all on the same page here, here's a quick refresh plus a little extra fun. So mammals are endotherms, which means they are dependent on internal heat generation. Reptiles are ectotherms. Body temperature is dependent on external sources like the sun. Mammals are on 24/7. Your body is working all the time without break, without fail. And reptiles are not. They're just on when they need to be. Mammals need to eat often, and that's because we use that food to generate heat in our bodies. And reptiles don't need to eat all the time. There are some reptiles out there that can go years without eating a meal, and they are just fine with it. We got to cover some reproduction. And the big ones for mammals is that we tend to have, by we, I'm kind of using humans in this example, but we have a pretty long gestation period. We have to lactate to feed that young. Sometimes we dedicate 18 plus years of parental care to those kids. We are investing time in them, and we tend to have very small batches of children. I probably shouldn't have put litters on there to describe humans. I think as I was putting this together, I was just kind of describing mammals in general. But if you compare that to reptiles, they produce eggs. Their kids can usually get their own food right out of the gate. They require very little, if any, parental care, and they can have a lot more babies. So if we think about this, what's more energetically costly? Is it being a mammal or being a reptile? Well, if you think about it, it's a lot cheaper to be a reptile, right? Now put that in the back of your brain bank as well, because we're going to take a quick trip down a story, and hopefully this video plays, but I guess we'll find out. And I'm going to narrate over this instead of making you listen to somebody else drone on. You get to hear my voice for a little bit longer. Okay, so 66 million years ago, all life on Earth literally had the worst day imaginable. An asteroid estimated to be like 9 miles wide hurtled toward Earth, weighing hundreds of billions of tons, giving it a pretty epic velocity. And I think they estimated that velocity, or the speed that it hit the planet, it was moving at about 50,000 miles per hour. That's 65 times faster than the speed of sound. And that's 666.66666 times faster than I-70's speed limit. Now that energy released from that impact was that of about 100 million nuclear bombs. I have no way to put that into a better way for you to visualize that. but it essentially wiped out about 75% of all life on Earth. It flash boiled the ocean. It sent trillions of tons of rock and ash and dust up into space that partially blocked out the sun for hundreds of years, thus affecting plant life. And like dominoes, this impact traveled up the food chain and caused major ecosystem collapse. And you can imagine how devastating that is. So this hypothesis, also known as the Alvarez hypothesis, or the one where an asteroid hit the Earth and caused the demise of the dinos, is the most widely accepted hypothesis in the world and the one that is most commonly taught in school systems. So it's one way where we should all be familiar with. So since its impact was so devastating, who possibly could have survived it? So the idea is that with dinosaurs out of the way, it was the mammals' time to shine. With no big dinosaurs around to eat you, you could fill those now vacant niches, thus inheriting the earth and now the dawn of the mammals, right? In reality, that's not the total case. Flowering plants survived it, like seeds and pollen can survive some pretty wild conditions. And this is actually a 3D computer generated model of what the first flowering plant looked like, that scientists could kind of piece together that puzzle. This is what they hypothesized that it looks like. All non-bird dinos like Triceratops died out, but those dinosaurs that did survive are the ancestors of today's modern birds, as I'm sure you know since you are bird people. Anything smaller than about 55 pounds that could take adequate shelter. I mean, mammals during the age of the dinosaurs didn't get very big. They were the size of rats or smaller, and they could avoid predation, and they spent a lot of their time underground. And the big dinosaurs filled that big animal niche. So the mammals didn't have a reason to get any bigger than like a squirrel. And that's right, you probably guessed it, fungus. Fungus survived the impact. And this is what it looked like. This is actually a fossilized fungi. And this is actually the first known land fungus that's dated back 635 million years. That's several hundred millions of years before the dinosaurs were even on the planet. And that's crazy to think about. I had a whole slide in here to give you a timeline to visualize it, and I scrapped it. So I hope that is okay with you all. Before they were on land, they've been documented in old seabeds. So they were aquatic fungi, and they likely had a flagella to propel them around in the water, which is super fascinating because you don't really think of fungi as being mobile. Okay, so with the big reptiles out and crafty little critters in, and this most widely accepted story about mammals and the rise of mammals and thus humans, this is where that world of making hypotheses gets a little, I'm using heavy air quotes, dreamy, when we actually have no idea what actually happened 66 million years ago. We can only do our best to piece things together in this puzzle based on evidence that we found. And what if I told you, and not really me told you, but what if there's another story that contributed and literally shaped the evolution of animals on this planet? And this idea comes from this doctor who I have greatly come to admire. He's from Johns Hopkins University, and his name is Dr. Arturo Casadevall, and he published a paper in 2012 called Fungi and the Rise of Mammals, and it's fascinating. It's a very quick read. He published it so that anyone can read it anytime, so if you just Google that, you can read it yourself. So I'm actually going to take what he wrote and expand on it a little bit because I want to spread this as far as I can because it's just, it's fascinating. So he suggests that the first few bits of the story are super great. The asteroid, well, not great, but they're all in line with the events and the evidence that we have. So the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and we all know that the Earth had a really, really bad day that day. And now we have mammals everywhere. And most people think that because the dinosaurs were wiped out, there's this massive space now, and mammals could just, like, there's the impact, that mammals could just crawl out of their holes and fill that space that is now vacant. Now, Casadevall thinks that there's a slight problem with that narrative. And if you look at the world today, we still have reptiles, crocodiles, alligators, skinks, lizards, snakes, etc. So clearly some reptiles survived that catastrophic event, and they crawled out of their holes just like mammals did. So back to that original question, if it's cheaper to be a reptile and it's easier to bounce back, why didn't we have a second reptilian age? Did they just get lucky? Well, it's not very likely if you kind of think about it, because right out of the gate, reptiles have two big advantages over mammals. They need way less food, which at the time was ideal because most of the planet's food sources were gone. Very little food was available compared to mammals who have to eat multiple times a day or at least once a day. And the second advantage reptiles have is that they can reproduce a lot faster in terms of numbers. They just make more babies. So why didn't they take off and create this age of reptiles? Okay, so age of reptiles. So Dr. Cassadevall's answer is that there's another player in the game, and a small, very difficult and almost invisible, but seriously powerful player. To get to this point, we have to know what was going on before the asteroid hit. So this image I have up is kind of to depict what the planet might have looked like before the asteroid hits. I know that that's probably the asteroid depicted there, but the point is the planet was significantly more forested. It was quite a bit warmer than it is today. The impact led to a rapid fall in temperature and there was no sun. So imagine this like dark, cold world with a bunch of decaying vegetation, and this major cataclysmic event is it's lesser known to be associated with this massive proliferation of fungi. And with all of these dead bodies everywhere and dead plants everywhere because there's no sun to keep them alive, fungi had a heyday. I mean, just an absolute heyday. There were mushrooms everywhere like there have never been mushrooms before. And if you look at the KT boundary, and I know I looked this up earlier, what the K and the T means, but I can't remember. Anyway, this is the physical evidence that we have in the rock layers that mark when the meteor hit. And it marks before and it marks after the dinos. So before the dinos is down here, after the dinos is up here. Okay, so here's the KT boundary. This is the line that marks the meteor hitting. And if you look right above it, this darker layer, that was all soil, and now it's like a fossilized layer. But if you scrape a little bit of that off and you look at it under a microscope, I'm kind of word vomiting things. I don't actually know how geologists do that. But if you look closely at this layer of fossilized soil, you'll find that it's filled with fungal spores. And it's really well documented. Like this whole layer is just packed full of spores and dirt. And it's just, oh, it's fascinating. There's that soil later. I knew I put an arrow in there somewhere. So you have this mold and mushrooms and dead bodies everywhere. You've also got these little shrew-like critters and alligators wandering around and just a crap load of fungus, like so much fungus. The world was just dominated by it. It was cool. There was a lot of food. It was a fungal dream, which can be really deadly. So like I mentioned before, reptiles can skip meals and everything, but mammals have two defenses against fungal infections. The first one is that we have an advanced immune system with white blood cells that can get rid of the bad stuff. The second is that reptiles, frogs, and plants, it's something that they don't have, and it's that we're warm. We're endotherms. Remember, fungi do really great until about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Any hotter than that, and they come apart. So literally their proteins, they denature, they can't be put back together. And so if the fungi were to enter a mammal, it would die. Mammal body temperatures are just too high and it keeps the fungi out, okay? Which is why most fungal infections are in the skin or at the surface. Now, since reptiles are ectotherms and require outside sources of heat to make their bodies work, like the sun, which at that time was blacked out for most of the part. It was a nuclear winter. So if you're a reptile and you get a fungal infection, you are not in a good place because there was no sun to warm you and there was no sun to keep you from getting that infection or to help you fight that infection. So all of a sudden you have mammals filling this gaping hole, really just flourishing in a way that they never could before because a fungus was helping them dominate over the reptiles. Okay, so let's take this a step further. Now, what is the optimal temperature by which you, a human being, are more protected, or the most you can be protected against fungi without having to constantly be eating? So we eat roughly 3 meals a day to keep warm, more or less. If we were less warm, we wouldn't have to eat quite so much. So how little could we eat and still be protected? Well, Dr. Casadevall got together with his mathematical biologist pal, Aviv Bergman, to punch out some of these numbers. And if you smash them together, oh, forgot that was in there. Oh. Anyway, if you smash these equations together, you, by equations, I mean the calorie use equation, and I stole these off the internet, so I don't even know if they're the right equations, forgive me, but the calorie use equation plus the equation that's needed to keep pathogens from entering your body. And if you smash them together, you get our body temperature, which is 98.6. And that's, fascinating. So that being said, there's a very real chance that our average body temperature evolved to actually keep out fungi. A very real chance. There's not a whole lot of evidence that supports that at this point, but it's a hypothesis that's in the work. Anyway, at least that's until the equation changes, and it's changing right now, literally as we speak, thanks to a global crisis known as climate change. So there's a species of fungus called Candida auris, and it's a microscopic fungi that has been living in the soil and on rocks for ages. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's really happy in moist, warm, tropical parts of the world. Then one day, it's 80 degrees out and the fungi is like, oh crap, and it dies because that's above its happy point and it's just too hot for it to survive. But there are a couple of individuals that, think that the heat isn't too bad and they kind of like the sauna, and then they reproduce, and then you get a whole bunch of them, and the same pattern repeats itself until the temperatures just keep climbing. And then all of a sudden you have 82 degrees, you have 84 degrees, and then all of a sudden you're at 90, 95, 98, 98.6. And now they have the ability to survive in a human body. And this fungus and probably several other species are gradually becoming temperature resistant, meaning they can more easily infect humans and other mammals. And we're already seeing this happen. That species of fungus that I mentioned, Candida auris, has already been documented to seriously infect humans since 2014. And we're seeing more and more strange and unknown fungal infections in people all over the world. And we can't really explain it because we don't know what species they are. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know how they're affecting the bodies. We don't know what symptoms they'll manifest. I mean, it's a scary thing, which is why I said that we're going to get just a little bit spooky. Now, extreme weather and temperature changes caused by climate change are causing a shift in the world of fungi, and there really isn't much that we can do about it except do our best to combat climate change and stay on top of treating these fungal infections. And spores are so small, teeny tiny, and you need a microscope to even see them, and it takes only one to cause an infection. In the beginning, we talked about a couple of the basics. They're in the air that we breathe, they're on the ground that we walk on, and it takes one just sticking to the sole of your shoe, getting into a hospital before there's a massive breakout. And the scary part is that thanks to modern medicine, our body temperatures are actually decreasing and have been decreasing over the last few decades. And there's a lot of evidence out there supporting this. And that's because our bodies aren't having to work as hard to stay healthy and protect itself thanks to modern medicine, which is awesome. But it's also making it easier for fungi to set up shop. So who knows? Maybe the age of fungi is what's gonna come next. Okay, I'm gonna move back on. That was a lot faster than I thought it was gonna be. I tend to get stuck in side tangents, so I hope that it's okay that this is just a little bit short, but it gives plenty of time for questions if anyone has any. I'll do my very best to answer them. If you have fungi ID questions, I'm more than happy to answer those too, because I've given a number of talks on that, and some of you have probably seen those talks. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm all ears.
Okay, thank you, Lyndzee. Don't see any questions, so yeah, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat on the YouTube channel. So, but yeah, fascinating subject. As I mentioned before the meeting, I was kind of looking forward to the connection that you were going to make between that and the rise of mammals, and I can certainly see how that's the strength of that hypothesis. That's certainly seems plausible to me. So, yeah, pretty fascinating to learn about all that. And I didn't realize that ringworms were actually a fungus, but I think I had a cat have an issue with that, and she didn't do too well. So,
yeah. Well, and that's why it spreads so easily, especially among younger people. And just touching a cat that has the infection will transfer the spores to your skin, and thus it can infiltrate your dermis layer and cause an infection in you. I've grew up on a farm and out in the country, so I had a number of run-ins with the ringworm. So
okay.
I'm pretty familiar with it.
Did not realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, it also glows under a black light. So if you have a rash that kind of looks relatively circular, or you just have one, shine a black light on it, and if it glows, it's a fungal infection.
Okay. Got a couple questions coming in. So Dan asks, can you talk about the commercial value of fungi in food and other industries?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's growing a lot. I think as people start to really explore the culinary value that fungi bring, and start capitalizing on that it adds a lot of value. I mean, a lot of different cuisines utilize different fungi. In America, we're only used to seeing portobellos or little white button mushrooms. And if you go to an Asian market or an Indian market, you'll find 20 different species. It's wild. If you have not been to, I think it's called Tai Bin, or one of the Asian markets there in Wichita, if you're in the Wichita area, highly suggest going in there and picking up a couple of different kinds of mushrooms that you haven't tried before, like a king oyster. Those are delicious. Little enokis are the tall, skinny white ones that are in clumps and packets. But it is a growing industry, and it's actually pretty lucrative, and it's pretty easy to grow your own fungi. If you haven't tried growing your own, I highly recommend it. You can get little grow your own mushroom kits online. I've tried a couple of them and I've been very successful. You can usually get more than one fruiting out of them. And there's also a growing market for medicinal uses of mushrooms and using them in teas. And I can't so much speak to its cancer fighting properties, but there is some strong evidence out there that they're packed full of healthy antioxidants and a lot of different vitamins. And I actually have a vial here. I have a reishi mushroom tincture that I will just use a dropper and put in my tea every morning. It's I haven't noticed anything, but I think it's because I'm not using it regularly. If I only have one vial, I don't want to use it all at once. But it is suggested that if you're intaking mushrooms for medicinal purposes, that you do it on a regular basis and not sporadic like I am. So I hope that answered your question. I know I kind of went on a couple of different rabbit holes there.
Okay. Tom kind of is tossing you a softball. Fungi, fungus, how do you say it? And what is the difference?
I love this question. Okay, so in one of the talks that I gave a couple weeks ago, I had a whole slide about how to pronounce it. And for the sake of no longer getting fungi jokes, I kind of steer away from that one. But it's really whatever makes you happy. There is no right or wrong way to pronounce it. I know mycologists, I have mycologist colleagues who pronounce it fungi. Some of them call it fungi, fungi. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's really whatever you're comfortable with. It tends to be a regional thing almost, or in different parts of the world, they pronounce it just a little bit differently. But yeah, there's no right or wrong way to do it. I say pick the one that puts a smile on your face when you're done saying it.
Okay, and lastly, someone you might know, Bob Gress, commented, "Great info, Lyndzee." So
Thanks,
there
Bob.
we go. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. If anybody has a last minute question, feel free. Otherwise, I want to thank you, Lyndzee, for a fascinating program. I knew this would be very interesting, and it sure was. So I learned quite a bit. So
Good.
thank you very much for doing a program for us.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And I could talk about fungi all the time. So if you ever want another one, just let me know. I do highly recommend reading Dr. Casadevall's paper on the rise of mammals. You can just Google it and find it anywhere. It's fantastic. He's got a couple of other supporting papers out for it. Yeah, so just give it a read. He's fascinating. I don't know if you're still seeing my screen or not, but I threw my contact info back up there. So if you ever have any questions or if you need help IDing something, as I mentioned in the beginning, I love a good mystery mushroom. So send me your pictures. I'm happy to help you ID stuff or answer any other questions you have. And if you don't already, be sure to pick up a pocket guide or I can mail you one. So,
okay,
thanks.
yeah, I need to pick up that pocket guide. I think I've got them all, but I don't think I have that one yet. So I need to get over there and get that one. So, and yeah, I did write down, I'm going to go look for that online, that title that you mentioned. So, so again, thank you very much. I guess we'll end it here, and join us next time. We'll be streaming again in November, like we have the last two times. And so let's see I need to look and see who's coming up. I've now forgotten. Let's see, next time is, okay, Dr. Jackie Augustine. She's the director of Audubon of Kansas, and her program is going to be 3 billion birds lost and what to do about it. So join us November 16th for that presentation. All right, thanks everyone for joining in. We'll see you next time.